Congress.
Of course.
President.
Mr. Congress, President, Congress, of course, President, asked. He also has President, legislation, President of Congress. President, Congress, legislation,
Congress.
President,
Congress.
President, Congress, legislation.
Congress.
Congress.
Of course, legislation, of course, legislation,
Of course.
legislation, Congress, President, legislation, of course,
President.
legislation,
Congress.
President, legislation, Congress,
President.
President.
President, other than President, callers, legislation, and
President.
Congress,
President.
President, course.
President.
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 Congress.
President.
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 President,
Congress.
call us.